Uspap, page 242. Appraisal development, client issues continued. Question number 2. I have been hired by an attorney representing a husband in a divorce to appraise certain assets held in the Marshall estate and to appear as an expert witness. I know my report will go to the court as well as to the parties on the other side of the litigation. Must the court and/or the parties on the other side of the litigation be identified as intended users? Question number 3. I frequently perform appraisals for purposes of purchase price allocation. The corporation that is my client will use the values for financial reporting purposes. My reports are provided to the auditors of the corporations for their review as part of the audit process. In such cases, must the auditors be identified as intended users? Question number 4. I am appraising a property for a regulated lender. I know that my appraisal will be reviewed by the bank's outside auditors and the OCC reviewers. Must the auditors and the OCC reviewers be identified as intended users? Response. The answer for each of the 4 questions is no. Intended users are identified by the appraiser through communication with the client and are not established based on who might receive or use the report. The definition of intended user has a specific meaning in Uspap. In the context of Uspap definition of intended user, the fact that the IRS, the court, an independent auditor, or the OCC in the above cases will use your report for review, audit, or other purposes does not automatically make them intended users. These parties receive the report through established processes of disclosure or regulation. One way to understand the concept is to think about what the intended use, that's kind of highlighted, is for each party. The appraiser must identify both the intended users and the intended use of the appraisal. Because these 2 factors affect many aspects of the appraisal assignment, such as the appropriate scope of work and the appropriate type of report. In each case, the use of the report by these other parties is different from the intended use the appraiser identified, which was related to the client's use. Such other parties may be evaluating the decision made by the appraiser's client to obtain an appraisal, as well as the appraisal results, and other matters of which the appraiser may not be aware. As an example, the client filling the estate tax return is using the appraisal as an indication of the amount to state on the tax form. However, the IRS may use the appraisal report to determine whether the value reported on the tax return is adequately supported. Whether the IRS agrees with the value and/or whether the IRS should challenge the taxpayer because they disagree with the value. See Advisory Opinion 36, Identification and Disclosure of Client, Intended Use, and Intended User. Number 126, Addressees, Clients, and Intended Users. Question: if the party to whom an appraisal report is addressed is the client and is also the only intended user, does Uspap require the report to state the intended user by name or type? Response: while Uspap requires all reports to state the client and any other intended users, Uspap does not dictate how this should be done. When there is only a single intended user, the client, a simple statement as part of the salutation may be sufficient. However, in other cases, it may not be adequate. The report must clearly and accurately set forth the appraisal in a manner that will not be misleading and must contain sufficient information to enable intended users to understand the report properly. The purpose of reporting requirements related to client and intended user identification is to, number one, ensure that the client and any other intended users can recognize their relationship to the assignment and report. And number two, ensure that unintended users will not be misled by notifying them that they are neither the client nor an intended user. End of page. Page 243. Advisory Opinion 36. Identification and disclosure of intended use and intended users. Provides extensive guidance on this topic, in addition to several examples of statements that may be appropriate for inclusion in a report, such as the following. This report is intended for use only by identify the client and identify any other intended users by name or type. Use of this report by others is not intended by the appraiser. Number 127. Appraising without knowing the intended use or intended user. Question: does Uspap allow me to appraise a property without knowing the intended use or user if there is an agreed upon scope of work? Response: no. Uspap requires an appraiser to identify the intended use and any intended users by name or type prior to determining the scope of work in an appraisal assignment. Number 128. Are borrowers intended users? Question. Frequently, the borrower in a mortgage finance transaction is provided with a copy of the appraisal report. And in most cases, the appraiser knows that the borrower will be receiving a copy of the appraisal report. When the appraiser is aware that the borrower or any other third party will receive a copy of the appraisal, does this make that third party an intended user? Response: no. The fact that a borrower or anyone else receives a copy of the appraisal report does not make them an intended user. The concept of an intended user in Uspap is framed within the context of the appraiser-client relationship. An intended user is defined in Uspap as the client and any other party as identified by name or type as users of the appraisal or appraisal review report by the appraiser, based on communication with the client at the time of the assignment. There are several things to note in this definition. First, intended users of the appraisal report must be identified by the appraiser. Secondly, this identification is made at the time the appraiser is engaged for the assignment, so the appraiser can make a prudent judgment about the scope of work to apply in the assignment and the level of detail to include in the report. It is also worth noting that the concept of intended use and intended users are related to the type and definition of value in an assignment. Appraisal reports for loan transactions are typically used to substantiate the real property's market value as underlying collateral for a particular loan. The fact that the lending institution is required by law or regulation to make certain disclosures to the borrower about the loan and the basis for the loan decision does not alter the intended use, intended users, or type and definition of value in the appraisal assignment. Advisory Opinion 36, Identification and Disclosure of Client, Intended Use, and Intended User further clarifies this issue by stating, parties who receive a copy of an appraisal or appraisal review report as a consequence of disclosure requirement applicable to an appraiser's client do not become intended users of the report unless they were specifically identified as intended users by the appraiser at the time of the assignment.